Κάτσε Νίκο, να δω αν σε πιάνει.
Ναι.
Εντάξει, είσαι οκ. Είμαστε οκ. We are ready.
You're ready already. Okay. Okay, good evening. Welcome to the Free Thinking Zone for our annual Battle of Ideas Festival satellite debate. Battle of Ideas Festival is a weekend of debate and discussion on science, art, politics, international relations, which this year took place at the Barbican Centre in London at the beginning of this month. This evening we're discussing from youth councils to school strikes, our kids taking over politics. I'm chairing, moderating. My name's Jeff Kidder. I'm Director of Membership and Events at the Academy of Ideas based in London. I'll just introduce our three panellists who will initially speak for 5 to 7 minutes, and then we'll open it up for discussion, conversation, dialogue, more generally. Firstly, to my left is Plamen Tonchev, who's the author, blogger, senior researcher and head of Asia Unit at the Institute of International Economic Relations in Athens, and a founding member of European think tank Network on China. Plamen will speak first. Then on my right, I have Eleni Derveni, who's a high school student and on the organising committee member of Fridays for Future in Greece, who will speak secondly. And thirdly, Nikos Sotirakopoulos, who's a lecturer in sociology at York St John University and author of The Rise of Lifestyle Activism and also an Identity Politics, and he's currently writing The Culture Wars, Understanding the Tribalist Mind.
Yeah.
And did I get that right?
Doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter.
More or
Okay,
less.
so there are three speakers, and then everybody else can contribute afterwards. So, without any further ado, Plamen.
Thanks, Jeff. I think that we're living through interesting times, which is a euphemism for tumultuous times. There's a massive upheaval on a global scale, all the way from Chile in South America through the streets of Paris every week, and there's been an upheaval in Hong Kong. Is that okay? There's been an upheaval in Hong Kong every day for about 5 months now, and young people are a big chunk of that. Of course, they have various causes, but one of the most prominent and visible causes is the one relating to climate change. In fact, Greta Thunberg, the 16-year-old teen, has become a symbol of that cause. And this is what I want to talk about, in fact, touch upon, and then of course I'll be happy to listen to a lot of other views. I think the debate on climate change should be seen as a sequence of 3 steps. In fact, every debate or every issue should be seen as a sequence of 3 steps. Step 1 would be acknowledging the problem, acknowledging there is a problem. Step 2 would be analyzing this problem, coming up with alternative possible solutions, strategies, how to address this problem. And step 3 would be action, implementing the best possible, the most appropriate solution. So where are we on climate change? I'm afraid that a lot of people are still stuck at step 1. We're still struggling to acknowledge there is a problem. There is an issue with climate change, but there's also a lot of denial. One of the men denying there's a problem is called Donald Trump, and he happens to sit in the White House, and he happens to be one of the most powerful men in the world. So we're still discussing whether climate change is man-made or whether it's a natural phenomenon. Now, if it's a natural phenomenon, why bother? Why have, what's all this fuss about? Many people do acknowledge that, yes, there is a problem. I've moved on to step 2. That is to say, discussing it and analyzing it. There's a debate on what we should do and what the optimal strategy should look like. There's one school of thought which puts forward the argument that the technological achievements of our age will provide us with all the necessary arsenal to tackle climate change, arrest its advance, and even restore the climate, bring it back to where it used to be. I call this the high-tech camp. I'm a big fan of technology, even if I do not understand all the intricacies and the practical implications of the technological revolution. But I'm old enough to remember the days without computers, without the internet, without smartphones. Young people may find this hard to grasp, but yes, there were times without smartphones. I was born in 1962 when Yuri Gagarin became the first man in space, and now the launch of manned spaceships is just not news anymore. So I know that we've come a long way, and I'm sure the future will be even brighter in technological terms. But I'm not sure that technology alone will be sufficient if we are to stop, let alone reverse, climate change. There's another school of thought which acknowledges climate change and the gravity of its potential consequences, but it seeks to strike a delicate balance between environmental protection and socio-economic development. They call it environment-friendly development. Let's call this camp the pro-growth camp. It brings together many developing countries. A big actor in this camp is China, the second biggest economy worldwide, with a hybrid status of an emerging superpower, and at the same time country with acute needs in many ways. China is the biggest contributor in CO2 pollution in absolute figures, though not in per capita terms. And there's India, of course, whose energy demand and volume of air pollution is expected to overtake China's within a decade or two. The key argument of all these developing countries is that they have to cater to the needs of their large population. But interestingly, a lot of the arguments of the pro-growth camp are taken on board by developed countries as well. The truth is, the bitter truth is, that nobody is happy to relinquish part of their wealth, convenience, lifestyle, etc. This is where Donald Trump steps in, with the United States federal government remaining resolutely in denial of climate change. I'm distinguishing between the federal government and the administration of certain states, which are actually in support of a pro-climate agenda. Now let's have a look at what's happening at the level of step 3, the level of action. It would be reasonable to assume that climate change is being tackled at all the global summits that have taken place. I will quickly run through the list of global summits on climate change. In 1992, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in Rio de Janeiro. 1997 saw the adoption of the Kyoto Protocol. For the first time then, binding greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets were set for industrialized countries. In 2007, the longer-term vision was introduced by the Bali Action Plan. There was the Copenhagen Summit in 2009, which did not result in the adoption of a new agreement, by the way. In 2011, countries signed up to the Durban Platform for Enhanced Action, ADP. A subsequent gatherings in Warsaw and then in Lima, Peru, all states were invited to submit their pledges towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And then, of course, there was the 2015 Paris Summit. So is this it? After all these summits, have we addressed climate change? Probably not. In fact, certainly not. And this is where young people step in. I'm no fan of direct democracy. Despite all its failings, I think that representative democracy is still a far better form of government. And there's a fairly legitimate question. Are climate protesters going too far? We've seen climate activists disrupting traffic in major capital cities to call for immediate action against climate change. And there are many more acts of civil disobedience on a global scale. And I would very much like to ask representatives, including our dear colleague Eleni here, representatives of Fridays for Future, why walk out of school? Why not stay at school and do your best to equip yourselves with the knowledge that you will need tomorrow to address climate change? Why not walk out on Saturdays and Sundays? What's wrong with, let's say, weekends for future? It'll be WFF instead of FFF. I mean, it's also a form of civil disobedience and action to be considered. I have to admit that Greta Thunberg has made a lot of sweeping statements. I have to admit that she may have made some mistakes that weaken the cause she's fighting for. I feel that the campaign run by Greta and her followers needs to be revisited, perhaps reconceptualized, revamped, recalibrated, you name it, and I'll be much obliged if you suggest the appropriate wording. But, and this is a big but, apart from philosophizing about the right wording, action will still be needed. And political will, to come back to this, will still be needed. I'm not convinced that technology alone will do the trick. In fact, there's a mounting body of indications that technology, say artificial intelligence, may do more harm than good. Plus the fact that there's been a lot of summits, a lot of talking and hand clapping, but our planet's climate is not doing very well these days. It is this worrying fact that feeds young people's anxiety. We need to understand what's driving them. We need to acknowledge the fact that climate change is a real issue of existential proportions, and young people have every right to worry about their future. I'll stop at this point, ready to listen to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Plamen. Eleni,
Okay.
floor is yours.
Before I proceed, I could answer to the question of Mr.
Please.
Plamen concerning FFF and why we strike on Fridays. I think one main point is that we strike because we want to show that our future education is irrelevant if the living conditions aren't well because we haven't combated climate change. And that is a main point. It's not that we do not do several actions on weekends. Even in Athens, we have strikes on Saturdays. We had a strike on Saturday on the 9th of November. We do bicycle strikes, we do clothes swaps, we do other kinds of events on the weekend where everyone can attend, but it's merely symbolic that we do it on Friday. Okay. So, to the question, are kids taking over politics? As a 17-year-old currently overwhelmed by the fact that governments refuse to take action against climate change, I'd love to be able to stand here and say, yes, we took over politics. But I've understood that it's not that easy. I've understood that the economy, wealthy corporations and influential individuals usually guide politics, along with the voters who support parties that follow this tactic. Youth movements such as Fridays for Future do undoubtedly have an impact on society. They stimulate the public discourse and encourage individuals to reflect about the topic, engage in activism, change their lifestyle, and potentially their vote. Although this increases the pressure on the government, the movement has not yet achieved its final goal. Politicians and adults sympathize with us, but taking measures that could mean losing political popularity, or for other adults being obligated to change their job, their tax payment, or their lifestyle are not an option for them. If efficient ecological measures would be taken, I would sympathize with workers of the fossil fuel or the cattle industry, and I would support a government that would facilitate the transition to a new industry or technology. But that does not mean that we have the choice to preserve these industries if we do not want the effects of climate change to become irreversible and disastrous. And such effects will affect younger generations longer than the older ones. To combat climate change, we need more voters who believe this. Minors should be given the opportunity to influence politics more directly, and that will be achieved by means such as, but not limited to, lowering the voting age. Many adolescents indeed do not have enough knowledge to understand certain situations, but you cannot tell me that all adults do. And of course, there is radicalism among the youth, but in older generations as well. Additionally, we have to consider that all minors in the European Union have access to free and quality education, something that could not be taken for granted in older generations, who, by the way, all have the right to vote. Furthermore, adolescents are not so afraid of adapting to new challenges or change their opinion. First of all, most of us are not yet terrorized by economic pressure, and this is why we do not link all topics to the maximization of profit. But besides that, changing views and norms can mean that a generation is slowly fading away, and that can mean aging, which is certainly a reason why conservatism is common among older generations. The argument of idealism is often used against adolescents. It is often characterized as idealism when someone passionately still fights against climate change, precarious living conditions, homelessness, sexism, discrimination, and the mass production of and selling of guns, although there might be political and economic difficulties. But in our world, where direct profit has gained a bigger importance than morality, we need this idealism as a counterweight to the injustice of this world. Pragmatism is important, but it is often interpreted solely in economic terms, that if we combat all of the above-mentioned issues, certain people are going to lose money. Not to mention that these certain people would be the wealthier if the matter would be handled with rationality and morality. Should loss of profit be a barrier to tackling injustice? Does such an attitude sound more logical to you? Gaining the right to vote and to engage more actively in politics as a minor is not only rational, but is also transmitting a sense of responsibility. It is a recognition that we do too have valid concerns and opinions. I don't believe that all adolescents make better political and ideological choices than adults. But I think it's not legitimate to argue the opposite, and adults are not burdened by such restrictions. What currently happens in politics will directly influence my future, possibly my whole life. I should have a say in it, and my voice should not be regarded as inferior simply because I have not passed the line of 18 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Nikos.
Yes, so I'm not going to talk so much about specific actions of young people like Greta. I have an opinion on that, but I think this is not the big topic. The big topic is how adults have kind of given up on any idea of moral and political leadership when it comes to these big issues. So in a way, young people being actively engaged in politics is not something new. So I was reading some statistics according to which 1 out of every 5 people who actually participated in the Russian Revolution were below the age of 20. And also in Greece, we've seen a lot of student movements in the past, not university students, school student movements that have actually managed to topple government policies and actually topple ministers of education. But I see one big difference today. And the difference I see is that although usually when such mobilization happens, what adults and what politicians say is, look, you are wrong and we are right because of this and this and this. So we have our policy and we think it's right, so you people are wrong. What we see today is that adults actually have given up on this role. And actually they invite this criticism. This is why we see something very unusual. We see, for example, when Greta is talking in the United Nations, and she's attacking basically the people there, when she says you have failed, these people are clapping. It's basically, yes, tell us more about how we have failed. It's like, it's almost masochistic. It's basically, tell us how bad we've been, tell us how much we've ruined things. And I think this is something noteworthy, this is something very interesting. And I think the reason why we see more and more children playing a very active role, not only the issue of the environment, but also, for example, the United States on the issue of gun ownership. If you remember last year, there was a mass shooting in school, and then some of the major advocates of gun control were students of this school that were put on big media and were put on central stage. So I think this was a bit sneaky, because this was politicians who wanted to impose gun control, basically having no clue how to do this, because this would include, changing the constitution and all that. So the sole argument was, look, here are some children crying, here are some children traumatized, which is indeed, that was something very traumatizing. So we need to do something because of these kids. And actually they made something even worse. They didn't say, look, these children are crying, therefore here's a solution. They said, listen, these children are crying, so these children need to tell us what to do. So basically, an issue that hasn't been solved for basically decades and centuries, the Democrats' approach was, here are these high school children that are going to solve this super complicated issue. And of course, I have all the admiration of the world for these children that could stand on CNN and address the nation on such a big issue, but I have very little respect for the politicians who kind of are so cowards on telling us what is exactly their position on this topic that they put these children at front. And another issue is that when young people look up to us, to adults, what do they see? They see people who basically were not that different from children. See how our governments are treating us. Our governments are not trusting us, for example, to smoke. They are not trusting us, and they are giving us a diet in the UK that you need to eat 5 fruits every day. This is what my mother told me when I was like 10 years old. We have our governments telling us how much alcohol you should consume every day, and we have our governments basically treating us as children. And you said something very interesting, allow the voting age to go at 16. So my question is, how can a government that is not trusting young people to watch Joker, and it's the idea that if you go and watch a violent film, you're going to be traumatized, how could these same people trust young people to go and vote? So again, it's very weird how this, let's say, the establishment sees us, all of us, as basically basket cases, as people who are incapable of taking life in their own hands, and at the same time they're telling us that young people have the answers to these problems. So my main message is, if you don't like, for example, Greta Thunberg, or the role that children or young people are playing, don't criticize young people. Criticize the adults that have given up to this public kind of sphere and public atmosphere. That's why I never like to use the term snowflakes. Snowflakes is a phrase that is used in the UK, talked about young people, and the idea is young people are very vulnerable, are very kind of, they can't be taken seriously. And my point is that if this is what is the case with young people, who is to blame is not these people, but it's us. Us who have educated these people, the parents, the teachers. So if you don't like the new generation, ask some serious questions to the older, basically, generation. And another thing is, we say, for example, that Greta is catastrophizing. But the question is, who has taught her that? If we're teaching young people that, not that they live in the brightest window in human history, where we have all this technology in our hands through which we could change even climate, nuclear energy or geoengineering or all that stuff. Instead of giving them the optimism that the future is up for grabs, we're passing them the message that basically they're victims. We're basically telling them, we have ruined it for you. And I find this patronizing. Because instead of telling to young people, look, the future is yours, the future is up for grabs, you can change history, we're basically telling them history is over and we have ended history for you. So my message at the end of the day is, instead of teaching young people how to be afraid, and instead of teaching them why the world is going to end in 30 years, let's give them some inspiration and let's give them the message that you have agency and you can be the people who can change history, but not based on fear, but based on your agency and based on your power.
Okay, thank you, Nikos. Okay. Can I just, right, okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to ask if anybody in the audience, anybody out there, has any questions or comments at this stage. Otherwise I'll get the panelists to comment on each other and they may well have things that will get come back on. So if anybody there wants to say anything at any stage, just put your hand up and we'll do it. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually have a question to you. My name is Maria. I'm also a part of the FFF here in Greece. And, well, you say that instead of teaching us how to be afraid, you should be inspiring us. And
Yes.
with you, I think you meant the older generations, but also the government. But what I don't understand, because you say that you should be saying, okay, the future is ours, we should grab it. The thing is, have you seen the scientific data? You say man can change climate. It's exactly what man has been doing for the past 100 and so years.
Yeah, that's true.
So man is changing climate. Man is just changing it into the worse. And also you say that we are the ones who should grasp the future and change it. And again, have you seen the scientific data? Do you know that it's actually your generation that has to do something? Because by the time that I graduate school in 2020, by the time I finish my bachelor in 2024, if I'm quick enough, By the time I also have a master's degree, maybe 2 years after, and by the time I have a PhD and can do some postdoc or whatever to tackle climate change, it will be already like 15 years after, 10 years after. And these 10 years, 15 years, are they going to go to waste?
Definitely not. I agree with you that. Oh wait, what?
No, okay, come back quickly and then we'll come back here.
Oh yeah. So yes, we are changing climate, but also in the last 2 centuries we have made climate so much safer for human beings. For example, see the deaths from climate catastrophes like floods, extreme heat, extreme cold. So this technology that you are right, that has changed climate, has also made us safer from the climate. So if, for example, you are a poor person in India, because of this technology, you are in a better position to face these challenges. So I'm not saying that there is not a problem. My point is that the way that we have managed to face previous challenges, we have eradicated diseases. We have, for example, built dams. Netherlands and Belgium are actually literally below sea, but because of their infrastructure, they have managed to face this problem. I believe that if we follow the human mind, and if we follow our creativity, we can solve this as well. We're some years away from nuclear fusion, for example, the cleanest form of energy. So I agree that yes, this is a big issue, but my point is that if we have this defeatist attitude, which comes again from above and comes from the older generation, not only we're not going to solve this problem, we're going to make this problem worse because we are throwing away our #1 asset, which is our mind. So if we follow this kind of fatalistic attitude, and by the way, we see these issues in this attitude in all issues. See, for example, what the right is telling about immigration. We are one step away from irreversible problems because immigrants are from Muslim countries are going to evade. So I see this, what some people call this culture of fear, that we see all problems as basically an existential disaster. My worry is that I see the same attitude in every problem, and I think that historically this is not how we have solved problems. So I think I understand what you're saying, and you are right to be worried, but the way to solve this is by saying, yes, we can do it. We can do it with more technology, with clean energy, with new forms of energy, but not with this culture of fatalism and fear that I see everywhere.
Okay. Do you want to come back on that, please? And then I'll
I would like to come
Yeah.
back if it's possible. I wanted to say that I think fear is actually one of the strongest means of inspiring someone, because I think at that point we can really be optimistic, and if the government tells you, yeah, you should fight for this, definitely, then we're going back to the 80s, maybe to the hippie movement, where they were labeled as hippies and they were the only ones caring for the environment, but they were also the hippies walking barefooted and discriminated from some other classes. So what I believe is that when you have this fear, you can also think logically. You can think what Maria said, that I know that if we do not act now, the living conditions in many years will be worse. So that is why I act now. And also, I think the problem is not with the technologies you mentioned. Technologies are usually great. The problem is over-consumerism and overproduction. So let me give you the example of insulin. Insulin has made the life of so many people much better. But for example, in the United States now, from some companies, it's sold at $1,000 because profitability and profitability extremism, one could say. So insulin is sold at $1,000 and a t-shirt might be sold at $2. So that is a problem in my opinion. The problem is that we see technologies as something that is bought as well and very expensively, so it cannot actually improve the lives of everyone. And other resources that are not necessary for the human being are sold very cheaply. And that's what leads to overconsumerism, and that's what leads to ecological catastrophes. So I think this existential disaster is what lets us think, okay, I do not need this t-shirt, of course I need this insulin to survive. So that's why I will fight against climate change. That's why I will say I do need the technologies to combat the issue, but I need to limit myself on other things.
Thank you. Plamen, do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, I'm afraid I have to take issue with
Yeah.
something that Nikos said previously about technologies, ensuring a better future for mankind over the last 2 centuries, was
Yeah.
it? Well, I don't know. I mean, if you look at New Delhi as we speak, it's in a state of crisis. Look at the air pollution levels in New Delhi. It's unbearable. And I'm sad to say this. I'm not targeting India, but there are very many cases like this. Look at Jakarta. I mean, Indonesia's capital city is to be moved to Kalimantan on an entirely different island because it's sinking. Look at Venice, which is sinking right now. Are these not the symptoms of climate change? There seems to be a serious issue. I happen to work a lot on Asia, and there's this big river, Mekong, which runs through Indochina, the whole peninsula, all the way from China down to Vietnam. And right now, as we speak, 100 dams are being built on Mekong. This overexploitation, this search for energy sources, of course, irrigation and all that, it's overexploitation of natural resources. Where is that technological supremacy that would make our life better? The level of the Mekong, the water level of the Mekong River is coming down, and millions of farmers are already suffering. There's something wrong with technology or the way we use technology. As we speak, China is actually increasing its coal output. It is, well, rhetorically at least, committed to the objectives of the Paris Accord. But at the same time, there was this news item in China Daily yesterday. Supposedly, the Chinese are reducing the consumption of coal and, of course, the levels of CO2. And then China Daily carries this story yesterday. China raw coal output registered stable growth in the first 10 months of the year. It went up apparently 4.5% compared to 2018. And this is official data from the National Bureau of Statistics. And then in the same triumphant tone, as if that were to be seen as an achievement, around 320 million tons of raw coal was produced last month, up 4.4% year on year, according to the National Bureau of Statistics. There's something terribly wrong going on with technology, or the way we use technology, or the way we set targets. And I actually have a lot of sympathy for the argument we may have to revisit the idea of consumerism and what exactly we want, and the way we want to see our lifestyle. But I will also take issue with the FFF movement. I think that the idea of being out there in the street, fists in the air and shouting in favor of addressing climate change doesn't help a lot because there's lack of focus. What exactly is the demand? What's the cause? I think that FFF campaigns need to be better focused. I think that these fuzzy messages actually take you nowhere. I think it'll help young people and all these FFF campaigners if they came up with very specific demands. Let's talk about CO2, let's talk about greenhouse gases, and let's set targets. Of course, there are targets set at all these international summits, and I suppose your targets could be a lot more advanced, and that would make a lot of sense. Even the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, is already saying one way or another that, listen, we're missing the targets and we need to accelerate, meeting these targets if we want to stay on track. I mean, there's a lot of specific stuff to come up with. Merely this fuzzy message, yes, let's stop climate change, doesn't tell people much, and people do not know a lot about all the technicalities of climate change. So I think you may have to become a bit more specific in order to be more comprehensive.
Is there anybody else who might ask anything or raise anything at this stage? No. Okay.
Can I make a point on
Yeah.
that? So let's think about you mentioned Indonesia. That's very interesting. So Indonesia, by the end of the century, is going to have the life, let's say they're going to be as wealthy as Netherlands is today. So let's think about it this way. If the worst case scenario of climate change is going to happen, the worst case, the International Panel for Climate Change, I'm taking the worst case. Would we rather the Indonesians being as rich as a Dutch person is today, or staying poor? Because my biggest worry is that the one most important issue that these poor countries are facing is cheap energy. And let's think about it this way. The biggest event in human history in the last quarter of a century, in my opinion, is 2 billion Chinese and people in India and Indonesia escaping poverty. And when we talk about these countries escaping poverty, we don't mean, oh, I had the phone and now I had a smartphone. We mean the difference between life and death. And cheap energy today in developing countries is an issue of life and death. So I would rather the guy in Bangladesh in half a century being rich and thus being able to build infrastructure to protect themselves from climate change, rather than reversing this thing that actually helped these countries escape poverty. And just remind you that in China, only in the last half of century, we had tens of millions of people dying literally from hunger. And when China entered into this process to industrialize itself, to open up a bit its economy, this is what literally saved people's lives, and this is what saved babies from dying early, which is why life expectancy before the Industrial Revolution was 35, and now it has gone to 75. And this is why population has gone from 1 billion to 70 billion. This basically means people don't die young. This is the explanation, and for me this is great news.
Maria.
I'll say it's funny that you're saying, let's think it's the worst case scenario of the climate crisis, which would be about 5-6 degrees over the degrees that we had in the Industrial Revolution. And then you add that you would rather someone in Bangladesh not be poor than to be poor. And for that, then you say, okay, we should focus on the economy so that poverty stops. And, well, again, I will say look at the scientific data, because if we say that we're in the worst case scenario of the climate crisis, people in Bangladesh will probably already be dead. It won't matter if they will have money or not. When we have 6 degrees over the actual temperature we had during the Industrial Revolution, the only zones where we will be able to live is actually Europe and a bit of Russia. And we have other problems here as well. So then poverty again. You said also hunger. You see that we cannot live 8 billion people in only Europe and maybe some of the US. You're saying worst case scenario of climate change, but then you're not realizing what other impact it is. Climate change is not only an ecological problem, it's also a social and economic problem, it's a health problem, it's everything. So your argumentation is not rigid.
If I may step in.
Yeah, I want to step in. Let's take more points.
Hang on. Eleni, and then Ollie, and then Plamen. Okay.
I want to say, you said industrialization saved people's lives. Now, I understand why you would say that, because technologies were evolved that actually did have a good impact to some extent to some people. But the thing is, already at the time of industrialization, people knew to some extent that this was harming their environment. They knew that the garbage of factories was tossed into rivers. They saw what it did to their environment. And actually, I believe that industrialization or making new technologies that can help combat hunger, such as GMOs, can be good, but we cannot do them without examining the way we're evolving these technologies. So we cannot just destroy our environment in order to help it afterwards. We have to be careful at every step, because if we allow climate change to have disastrous effects, the thing is that it will not only make life unpleasant for us, it will make life unbearable for someone. Many will die. So actually, we need technologies to combat this, but we also need to step back at some things we do. So when we continue with evolving technologies that at this point actually do not have a great impact on society, such as every new technology for every new mobile phone or television, this is negative. Technology and progress or the attempt to make progress is not always positive.
So I think that when people talk about climate change, understandably, they get very emotionally invested, and I think actually that's a really good thing that, especially the youngest generation is really taking pride and care in their planet, and I think actually that's a really heartening and wonderful thing to see. My concern is though, is when people talk about how to look after the planet or maintain the environment, the solutions, as well-intentioned as they are, don't sound to me particularly progressive. And I think one of the things I noticed out of what you mentioned was about the technology, and that I think technological advancement absolutely is the answer to it, but I don't see why that is necessarily a bad thing. We've created bridges to cope with getting across places, dams keep the water out if sea levels do go up. These are solutions we do have, and I don't actually think that suggesting that scarcity and lack of consumerism is a good thing, because I think actually the consuming of stuff and the creation of more is actually a very, very forward-thinking one. And to go around saying, well, we need to not have this T-shirt so we can have our incident, actually is a very regressive idea. It doesn't suggest to me that people are thinking very progressively, and that it's just saying that everyone should just moderate your desires, stop wanting things that you shouldn't have. Well, actually, we should have those things, and if history has told us that humanity may be the cause of climate change, but it's also the solution, and advocating what is essentially austerity measures and banning things, and what you're actually doing really is you're asking the government to tax us all way more. There is, as you know, there's a finite resource of stuff out there, and if we go around doing that, you're just going to kind of put a sticking plaster over a problem that is only going to get worse. So we have to go forward, and we need to talk about that shortly.
Plamen, do you want to comment?
I'm glad that Maria touched upon the issue of population. We're speaking about 8 billion as the size of the world's population. If I'm not wrong, it's about 7.6 or 7.7 billion, which is already bad enough, of course. But I think that we're talking about a set of intertwined issues here. It's not just climate change. Climate change is a function of a lot of other factors preceding, like climate change, leading to climate change. Overpopulation is something we should talk about, and it's the elephant in the room. And we're not talking about it, mostly because of moral constraints. It's a bad thing to talk about population. A newborn baby is what? It's a blessing. What's wrong with that? Any newborn baby is good news. No, not necessarily. Let me tell you that right after the Second World War, the world population was in the range of 2.5 billion. It is now more than 3 times that, 7.6 or 7.7 billion. And we're heading towards 10 billion towards the, by the middle of the century. This is just not sustainable, let's be frank about it. If this planet's population has grown 3 times, it is still the same planet with the same resources. And if the population grows 4 times, it's still the same planet with even fewer resources by the middle of the century. We have a fundamental problem. Houston, we have a problem here. We have to admit that. Let me tell you something that you in the UK are very much aware of, this incident with the Vietnamese migrants who died in a truck, in a lorry that was a refrigerator,
Yeah.
right? I remember talking to Vietnamese state officials back in Hanoi, in Vietnam, in 2002, 2003, which is 15 years back, right? 16 years back. Back then, Vietnam's population was 80 million. It is now 95 million, all right? It's gone up by about 15 million within 15 years or so. I remember that back then, in 2003, their concern was that every single year, about 1 million young people would join the labour market, and of course the economy was not in a position to create that many jobs. So their concern back then, 15 or 16 years back, was Vietnam was going to be yet another Philippines, a labour exporter. Well, they were right. This is why you have the Vietnamese people, those wretched migrants dying in that refrigerator. And of course, you cannot stop this unless we think of a way to arrest this overpopulation, which is just becoming uncontrollable. We have to think of birth controls.
May I ask quickly, do you
It's
have
becoming runaway.
do you have children?
Yes.
Do you regret your decision to have them?
No.
Well, do you not see that by advocating population controls, you are going to be asking people like your former self to not have children? What is your message to your perhaps daughter or son who wants to have a child of their own? Are you going to say you should not have them?
Listen, we are talking about having a couple of children, 3 children in our European or Western standards. We're not talking about having 8 or 10 children.
Are people having 8 and 10 children?
Oh yes, they do. Of course they do.
But en masse?
Okay, okay.
Of course they do.
Okay.
So very quickly, because we talk about science, there is no IPCC scenario where all Bangladesians die, so just to put it out there. But I would ask, what is the actual solution? Because let's say we reduce CO2 emissions. Let's say we take Kyoto, which was one of the most radical solutions. The actual effect of Kyoto on temperature would be to delay climate change for 5 years. So we'd spend trillions and trillions, and the guy who would be drawn from sea level rise in 2100 would be drawn in 2105. So my problem is that we are so much focused on reducing CO2, which is going to have a minimum effect, and we don't see other solutions. And keep in mind that according to World Health Organization, from 2 till 5 million people every year are dying from energy poverty. Energy poverty simply means I haven't got electricity at home, which means I'm burning basically dead animals or trash to keep warm and cook. So telling to these people you're going to have less cheap energy is basically telling them you're going to die. Now on overpopulation, here's where we're going to disagree. We're asking where's the disagreement? Here it is. Because resources do not grow into trees. We create these resources, we create more food, we create new forms of energy. So I'm not so much worried about resources as long as we keep alive the flame of productivity. And basically it's what our friend over there said. If we're going to put population down, who is going to die? Or who is the mother who is not going to be allowed to have more than 2 children? And Plamen is right, there are countries where they give birth to, let's say, 8 children. But the question is, why do they do this? Because some of them might die by the age of 3, or this is also because these countries do not have the protection networks, so once you stop working, it is your children that will take care of you. So I see your point, but also let's see why it is that in these countries they have so many children. It's not that they say, what am I going to do today? I'm going to give birth to 3 more children. So the issue with overpopulation is always, who are these people who are too many? Because no one says, you know, my family is overpopulated or my country is overpopulated. And if you see some of the big overpopulation kind of institutions, they never talk about Europe or the United States. They always talk about these people out there. Africa, for example. So sometimes, I'm not saying this is you, sometimes there is a bit of racism there. Or see, for example, was it David Attenborough who says, I don't want more immigrants from like Syria because that's basically we are basically encouraging this. So some of the people who are very, you know, they have this face of we are the moral kind of leaders of humanity. When they talk about overpopulation, they enter a bit of a shady territory. That's why I'm a bit worried. And the last thing, all the predictions about overpopulation have been historically wrong. Remember Paul Ehrlich in the 60s? He was saying by 1990, the United Kingdom is going to be basically a country in starvation, and the population would be like halved because everyone would starve. And what happened? He was significantly wrong. So throughout history, all our bad predictions have been not correct. Why? Because they don't take one thing into accordance, which is this: our minds and our capacity into finding solutions. But to finding solutions, people need to be free. That's why I'm a bit worried that if we try to solve climate change by, let's say, imposing a controlled economy or imposing limits to human creativity, we're going to throw away the one weapon we have to actually solve these problems.
One thing, I just said, one thing on the population, at the main festival in London, we had a debate on birth strike, which is a campaign, I don't know if it's UK, started in the UK, but it's people in the UK who are not having children, or they think they themselves are not having children because of the environment. So that may be true or not, some of the things you've said, but there is actually within Western societies a thought that maybe people themselves should restrict what they do in terms of having families, in terms of the population. So it's a more recent expression of that. So it's not all over there. But anyway, I'll bring you back and then over there.
Okay, I wanted to say that I think it's difficult as Europeans to tell to Asian populations stop having children. Or Africans, because in Europe there are tendencies to have less children. That's why I'm referring to other continents. This seems, and may be as well imperialistic, this seems as something oppressive, but the thing is that there were also initiatives from Asian countries like China to have such policy, the one-child policy. And why did they do that? They didn't do that simply because they saw that the capacity of the country is not enough for so many children, but actually if so many children are, and more children are being born, then actually the demographics change in a way that there is more poverty among the young, because they have to take care, and they are pressured, and the capacities become less, and that is actually not a way of tackling poverty, but it is also one of the sources of poverty. And I want to get back to what you said before, that the tackling of climate change is sometimes regressive because we limit ourselves in certain things. And I know that very well because, for example, as a 14-year-old, I had the dream of traveling the world, as many 14-year-olds. And then I turned 15, and I learned that every flight has an immense carbon footprint. How did you think that feels? I'm not suggesting that I won't ever travel because of the carbon footprint, but I'm suggesting that I should find other means to travel, even if flying is the simplest one, up until technologies are evolved in a way where flying actually isn't that ecologically damaging. So we have to do the same with clothes, and we have to do the same with food. Not everyone can just, the cattle industry has an immense impact on the environment, and we cannot just continue eating meat like nothing is going on, just not to seem regressive. We have to limit ourselves until we find other solutions, and that I think is progress, not regression.
Okay, just here and then back there.
No, I just wanted to talk about population because it's something I've looked at from different directions. There are a lot of myths about population, and I really recommend the television programme that the late Hans Rosling, Swedish professor, made, which I think is still on YouTube, called, I think, The Truth About Population, or Population Panic. So one thing is that the number of babies being born in the world is levelling off, and some people think that we've already passed peak baby, as in the absolute maximum number of babies. We've certainly passed peak birth rate, because the way the world tends to go is that the more developed a country is and the richer a country is, the fewer children people have, partly because, as Nikos said, you're no longer thinking half of my children will die before they finish school, and partly because if you have the option to send your children to school or maybe university, you tend to think, oh well, we'll have 2 children and then we can give them the best of everything, instead of we'll have 6 children because we need them to work in the fields. So birth rate is tending to fall, but population continues to rise. Why is that? It's because we're living longer. So ironically, people like David Attenborough, who run around saying, isn't it awful, population is rising. Population is rising because of people like him who are living to 92 instead of dying in their youth. And personally, I think that's a wonderful thing, because all my values start from human beings. Right? When people say there are too many humans, I say, well, too many for what? Because by what measure are you going to measure the value of things if you're not measuring it by human beings? Yes, every baby is a gift and a wonderful, and the beginning of a new world. And although, personally, I think the way that climate is approached is too catastrophized, and I think if you do read the IPCC reports, the worst cases, the probable cases are not everybody will be dead in 50 years. And if you talk to climate scientists, I have some friends who say this is really unhelpful, because now I'm trying to have arguments on both sides. I'm trying to have arguments with people who say it's not happening, and I'm also trying to have arguments with people who say, oh, we're all going to be dead. It's like, no, calm down, we can fix this. But Maria, I may have some issues with some of the content and the way that some of the campaigns are done, but I think it's a great thing that we have more people in the world who are seeing problems and trying to find ways to solve them. But I just think it's really important we hang on to what is the core value here? What is it about? Are we concerned that there's a green and blue ball of rock and water and trees, and we want to keep it exactly as it is? Or are we thinking human beings are amazing and wonderful, and as far as we know, the only thing in the universe that even understands that things have meaning or ascribes values to things, and we want the humans in the world to have the best possible lives, and that includes clean air and clean water, and a lot of technology is still helping to clear that up. The reason New Delhi is so full of smog is because it's full of people who are burning charcoal and wood and animal dung to cook, to heat water, to heat their homes, whereas we don't do that in developed countries. We have electricity and relatively clean gas, and that's why our air is so much cleaner than it was 50 years ago, and that's because that's more technology. And yes, it's true, when we had the Industrial Revolution, they burnt coal everywhere. They didn't think, oh, are we going to affect the climate? They didn't think, oh, why is the air black? That's terrible. They were just going, we can have sewers, we can make stuff cheaper. But now we have science, and we can see, and we can say, oh look, if we burn coal, that's really polluting, not just CO2, but also makes the air terrible to breathe. If we have nuclear power, we can have much less pollution and bring electricity even to places in Africa and Asia, so they don't have to burn stuff in their houses, so they can have all the things that we have.
So I would like to keep in your way of thinking and add a few more things, because actually you explained half of what I had in mind, so thank you. So another thing that was discussed, for example, was like air pollution in India, but we have to take into account that what happens is, like, during the development phase, what happens first, that people pollute more, and then after a certain level of development, this goes down. So that was very much obvious in Europe, but it's still in China. So like a few years ago, the situation was comparable to New Delhi, and now it starts improving. So there's like part of the development cycle. You go to industrialization, and then you pollute more, and then you get richer. You said, okay, first of all, when you get richer, first of all, you have to feed yourself, so you don't really care about your environment. But when you feed yourself, then you say, okay, I'm ready to invest to a more clean environment. So it's proven decades after decades that this is